I think we're safe to go ahead and get started. I think we have a good crew here. For those of you who do not know me, welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jeff Schaff. I'm the Director of Talent Strategy at the Toledo Regional Chamber of Commerce. Today's topic is Understanding Unconscious Bias, presented by Sheila Eason from the Employers Association. We're excited for this morning's session. We have actually held this session in the past, specifically for our Summer in the City interns last year, but our attendance this year is off the chart. So we're really excited for this. I'd like to recognize some of our partners for today's event. Certainly the Employers Association, Destination Toledo. This was a joint event for both of our organizations, as well as Epic Toledo. I'd like to welcome our Summer in the City interns who are interning virtually this year and not getting to experience the Toledo that we're all used to, but they are having a great experience with awesome professional development. I'd also like to welcome any elected officials who might be joining us today. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have video capability, we'd love to see your smiling face, but we do ask that you please mute yourself during the presentation so that it makes it easier for everyone to hear Sheila's presentation. If you have any problems with the Zoom interface during the session, please send a direct chat message to either me or Julie Sanderson. And if you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat box in the Zoom control panel. There's a chance that Sheila will answer your question later in the session, so please be patient if your question is not addressed right away. We'll have some time for questions at the end. Now, without further ado, I will turn it over to Sheila Eason, our presenter, who is currently a senior HR consultant at the Employers Association. Sheila has over 25 years of experience in human resources, where she has spent many of those years working in diversity and inclusion. So take it away, Sheila.
All right. Thank you so much, Jeff and Julie, for inviting me back again this year. We did have a great time last year with the summer interns. And so we have a lot of ground to cover here today. So we're going to go ahead and get started. As Jeff said, our topic today is consciously overcoming unconscious bias. Let me also say that it's also referred to as implicit bias. So you're going to hear me use those terms probably interchangeably throughout our time here this morning. So I just wanted to give you a heads up. This is just simply our disclaimer, and basically all it says is that I am not rendering any type of legal advice here to you today. I'm not an attorney, but I have been doing this work for quite some time, but I'm not giving any type of legal advice. So our objectives, our learning objectives here are very simple today. We're going to talk, first of all, start off by talking about bias. And what is bias before we delve into unconscious bias, to get a level of understanding of what bias is and what causes it. Then we'll spend some time talking about unconscious bias. We'll look at its origins, where does it come from? And the bulk of our presentation here today is really going to focus on debiasing strategy. So how the premise, I'm starting with the premise that every single one of us have bias. I know sometimes people don't recognize that, or they don't realize it, or it's hard for people to accept. And I think that the reason why is because oftentimes when people hear bias, they automatically assume that someone is referring to racism, and that's not the case. But we want to start with the premise that we all have bias on some level, and we're going to talk about some strategies to address our bias. So let's just jump right into this. So what is bias? So bias is the tendency or inclination or prejudice that we have for or against something, toward or against something. It's okay when we have bias towards certain brands. Some of you, when we look at, two diverging sides, some of you may prefer Apple over Android, right? Some of you may prefer Pepsi over Coke. Some of you may prefer Adidas over Nike, or there are other brands that you like, right? So we have a bias towards certain brands. Another area of bias is towards teams, right? We're in Ohio, Northwest Ohio, and I'm sure we have a lot of Buckeye fans out there, right? And I'm sure we have some Michigan State, and other type of fans out there. And it's okay to have bias in those areas. Where it becomes problematic is when we have biases towards people. And bias is often characterized as stereotypes about people that's based on their association with a particular group. So, their race, their gender, their ethnicity, whether it's a person with a disability. That's where it really becomes problematic. And also, some of you who are familiar with EEO and compliance, and you're familiar with discrimination law, you will understand that these characteristics are often referred to as protected characteristics, which it is illegal to discriminate against. So when we think in terms of bias, we also think in terms of the fact that we can be operating in discriminatory practices when we display bias. Bias, as I said earlier, that they are stereotypes, right? And often those stereotypes, it's often based on stereotypes rather than knowledge of a particular individual or circumstance. So when we have bias towards an individual and we don't know that individual, it's simply based off of the bias that we have, the stereotype that we have. But we don't know that that stereotype is true or accurate of that individual. Bias results in shortcuts that result in prejudgments, and those prejudgments lead us to rash decisions. And as I said, discriminatory practices. So if we think in terms of, many of you are employers and you're responsible for hiring, if we think in terms of bias impacting our decision making, if we have bias towards certain groups of individuals, it can certainly impact who we hire. It impacts the decisions that we make in terms of who we promote or who we elevate in our organizations. And so keep those things in mind. So think in terms of how the brain works. So the brain operates on two levels. The first level is the conscious brain. And with the conscious brain, think of it in terms of, this is our explicit thinking. So in this level of thinking, our thinking is more deliberate. It's more intentional. It's slower. We're more thoughtful and deliberate in our thinking. But then on the second level is the unconscious level, or the implicit thinking. And this is unconscious. It operates without really us thinking about it. And it doesn't require really any effort on our part. And as you see there, it says it's faster than the conscious brain function. And it often overrides our brain functioning. And this level, the unconscious brain, the unconscious or implicit level, is where our implicit biases lie. So let's look at that a little bit more closely. So again, we have these two levels. We have the conscious level, we have the unconscious level, and so both levels of bias. And our conscious bias, this is where we know that we're prejudiced. This is where we know that we have preferences. We're very explicit about that. And the truth is that other people can observe this in our behavior. Unconscious bias is where we are unaware of our prejudice, and we actually believe that we are acting objectively and fairly. So let's look at a specific example as it relates to gender bias. So again, we're talking about these two levels of bias, the conscious bias and the unconscious bias. So on the conscious level, someone says, I do not like to work with women. That's a very conscious, very deliberate decision. I don't like to work with women. Someone may say women are not fit to do this job. So think in terms, as an example, think in terms of maybe the construction industry and someone who is hiring for open positions. And if that hiring manager has a belief that women are not fit for this job, then he or she will not hire that individual for that job. But again, keep in mind, on the conscious level, that is discriminatory. Another thought is that's a woman's job, or men do not do that. So on the conscious level, someone may believe that there are traditional jobs that are appropriate for men and traditional jobs that are appropriate for women. That's conscious bias. But when we look at unconscious bias, and remember I just said that on the unconscious level, you may be thinking that you're acting fairly, that you're acting objectively. And so someone may think, well, she won't want to be promoted because she just had a baby. So the person who has that thought may be thinking that way out of caring for his or her employee and saying, well, she just had a baby. She may not want to be promoted. That might take her away from her child. And so I'm not going to approach her about this promotional opportunity. And again, that's unconscious bias because it's based on an assumption. Another thought is we have to watch her travel schedule because she can't travel that much. Again, that's based on an assumption. The way we overcome assumptions is simply by asking. Another thought, well, we're going golfing. She wouldn't be interested. She probably has to get home to the children, or she probably has things that she needs to take care of at home, right? So again, on the unconscious level, the person may be thinking that they're objective, they're being fair, but they're really not. So what causes implicit bias? So here, our brains are operating on autopilot. So our brains, are just wired to be more efficient with energy. Our brains have a tendency to just operate on autopilot. Here's something to think about. Have you ever been, let's say you've been traveling to go to the grocery store, and maybe you're listening to music and you're focused and you're intent on going to the grocery store. However, you end up at your office, your work office, right? So your brain is on autopilot because your brain is trained, our brains are trained to recognize patterns. And then we make assumptions based on past experience or associations, and then we act. So we recognize the patterns, then we make the assumption, and that's based on past experience. So again, in the example that we're intending to go to the grocery store, but we end up at our work office where our brains are on autopilot. And so we're recognizing the pattern, the travel pattern that we utilize to go to our office. Our brains love assumptions, right? Assumptions are what guide our unconscious thinking. But if we really want to be careful about making assumptions, we need to test our assumptions. And we can test our assumptions by asking ourselves these questions. So how do I know it to be true? So let's go back to one of the examples that I shared with you as it relates to gender bias. So the assumption is that if a female the assumption is a female wouldn't want to be promoted because she just had a baby. We should ask ourselves, how do I know that that is true? Do I know it's true? Have I even asked her? What is that assumption based on? Is it based on an honest belief? Is it based on information that I have? Is it based on a conversation that I've previously had with this individual? Or is it just simply based on my assumption about what she would like or what her needs are? And then another question to ask ourselves is, if he or she were a man or a woman, or fill in the blanks, if this individual was able-bodied versus a person with a disability, if this person was a white person versus a black person, would I believe what I believe? Would I make the same assumption? So exactly what is this thing called implicit bias? Well, according to the Ohio State University Current Institute for the Study of Race and Ethnicity, and I would certainly encourage you all to visit their website. They have a ton of information out there about implicit bias. Theirs is more focused on from a research standpoint, but they have a ton of information out there. And they define implicit bias as attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, our actions, our decisions in an unconscious manner. And so when we think about this, again, our attitudes or our stereotypes can affect our decision making. And just think in terms of you all are employers, your business owners, and just think in terms of the type of decisions that you make on a daily basis. And is implicit bias impacting those decisions? Does your implicit bias impact how you are interacting with individuals? Does it interact or impact how you interact with your customers, with your employees, with your vendors? We have to think about those types of things. Implicit bias occurs when individuals, again, make judgments about people, and again, on the basis of what we typically call protected classes in the HR world, but based on characteristics. And you see some of the things there. We make judgments based on gender, race, and disability, socioeconomic status. We even make judgments based on people's positions in our organizations. If someone holds a higher level position, such as a president or a vice president or director, we make judgments in those areas. So it crosses the full circle. So with implicit bias, again, I mentioned earlier, it's automatic and it's involuntary. It requires no conscious effort on our part. It just happens because, again, it's operating on an unconscious level. And what happens is that we end up sorting people into groups, right? So think in terms of, have you ever been at a large event? I'm sure none of us have been at large events anytime recently, but just think maybe 6 months ago, the last time you were at a large event. Let's say you walked into that room, and what our brains do is we automatically begin to sort people into groups, right? So we look and we scan the room, and so we start to sort, okay, well, that's the young group. Or that's the Black group, or that's the white group, or that's the female group. And so our brains automatically do that. With implicit bias, the beliefs that we hold, the judgments that we hold, the assumptions that we hold are really deeply ingrained. And they influence our behavior. Again, it influences our behavior, our judgments, our beliefs, our values, and so forth. And implicit bias, it develops over a lifetime. It really starts, evidence shows that it starts as early as 4 years old. So what causes people to be biased? So again, what happens is people will discriminate between those who are like them. So they're in group. And those who are not like them are a part of the out group. So think in terms of your employment practices. So, you may have a bias towards a certain group of people who look like you, people who have the same background as you, the same experiences as you. And so that's considered your in-group. We're going to spend a little bit more time later talking more about in-group versus out-group, because it's really important, because we have to really look at who are we allowing ourselves to be connected to, and who are we interacting with, because we are creatures of habit, right? We tend to gravitate towards those people who are like us. And so that is what causes our bias. But we have to be willing to step out of our comfort zones and out of our in-groups to allow people in the out group to be present with us. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in just a few minutes. So here are some of the origins of implicit bias. And I really like this explanation. It's repeated exposure to the same messaging that we receive throughout our life experiences. So think about that. It's the repeated messaging that we hear or that we receive. So that happens through our upbringing. So think in terms of, what were you told? What were you taught when you were growing up? By family, by friends? What were some things that you were taught by your teachers? What were some of the early life experiences that you had? Culture, social conditioning. And as I said, it starts as early as 2 years old. Peer pressure. Our implicit biases can be impacted by peer pressure. So we can be influenced by those individuals who we interact with on a regular basis. And we may not necessarily believe the same thing that they believe, but just simply being connected with them and receiving these repeated messages can impact us. Our institutions, our churches, our schools, those institutions that we are connected to, when we are receiving repeated exposure to the same messaging. Media, whether it's social media or traditional media, just think in terms of our social media these days and the type of messaging that we receive, the type of messaging that we see on a regular basis. That can impact us and that can impact our beliefs. Think in terms of, for instance, media. So if we receive repeated exposure to, for instance, Black men as criminals, that impacts us and helps to formulate our beliefs. Or if we see, repeated messages or hear repeated messages about, for instance, millennials. We've all heard stereotypes about millennials, right? That they're lazy. All they do is spend time on their devices and so forth. We keep hearing these repeated messages over and over again, and it impacts us. So here is an exercise that I'd like to encourage you all to do. We have such a large group here today. Normally in a live training, I would have you break out into groups and complete this exercise. But we have too large, I don't want to say too large, we have a very large group here today. So I want to encourage you all, you'll receive a copy of this presentation. I want to encourage you all to think about this and go through this exercise. I'm going to go through it myself to show you, how it's done. So the first question is, where did you grow up? So for me, I grew up in Dayton, Ohio. I was born and raised in Dayton, Ohio, outside of Trotwood, Madison. Some of you may be familiar with that area. I attended Trotwood Madison High School and graduated from there. What other cultural groups and identities and practices did you encounter? And I have to honestly say that in my upbringing, while the city of Trotwood itself was, at least back in the day, in the 80s and 90s, was really seen as more racist. I was kind of, my family, my brothers and I, we were kind of sheltered a little bit. In terms of, I would describe it more as we were in a bubble. And so our interactions included people of all cultures. They're from an ethnicity standpoint, sexual orientation. We played sports, and so we interacted with a lot of different people. So we didn't necessarily just interact with one group of people. We didn't just interact with African American people. So we were exposed. Where the culture shock for me came into place was when I attended Bowling Green State University, and I'm a proud alumni. But back in the early 90s, it was not an inclusive environment. So when I attended the university, it was a culture shock for me because I came from an environment where I was exposed to a lot of different cultures and practices. but it was not the same for me when I attended BG. Now, let me say this. I have my good friend is over there running the department and bringing a lot of belonging and inclusivity to the campus there. So a lot of things have changed and it is much better. But the messages that I received when I attended that university was that I was different. And that I didn't always feel a sense of belonging. The fourth one, how has my background experiences influenced perceptions of other cultures? Well, from early on, I had a very positive perception of other cultures because I interacted with different cultures a lot. As I've come to, be older, not my perception, but my experiences with different cultures have, changed and evolved. Some have been positive, some have been not so positive. But even as I have come along in my own thinking, I still appreciate and value all cultures. And that's why I'm in the field that I'm in. So that's how you go about doing this exercise. Again, I would encourage you all to do this yourself. Maybe do this exercise with your team members, your family members, because what it does is it opens up your eyes to where did I develop the beliefs that I have? Where did all of this start? Why do I believe what I believe about certain cultures or ethnicities? So we'll keep moving along here. So why, again, is implicit bias so important? It can be a predictor of behavior and decision-making, flat out. It is a good predictor of our behavior and our decision-making. It gives us a framework for understanding the underlying factors that drive overt racism. Challenging implicit bias can help us align our good intentions with our desired outcomes. So keep in mind that our implicit bias impacts our intentions and our desired outcomes. What we really desire to happen doesn't always align with the biases that we have. For instance, if our true desire is to be fair and to be inclusive and to be welcoming, if our true desire, for instance, is to make sure that our hiring practices are inclusive, that in our work environments, it's inclusive, that everyone feels a sense of belonging, everyone feels a sense of connectedness. But what we do, some of our practices, our institutional practices, don't align with those beliefs. That's where we have to recognize that our implicit biases are impacting our decisions and guiding our decisions. Discussing implicit bias doesn't mean ignoring other causes of disparity, but it helps us to see really the entire picture. We are wired to default to implicit processing. And again, according to the Curran Institute, there are 4 conditions under which we are most likely to make decisions on implicit biases. And this is really interesting. I thought this was really great research. So when we have ambiguous or incomplete information, so when we don't have all of the information that we need, we have an incomplete picture. Under those conditions, we will make decisions based on our implicit biases because we don't have all of the information. When our brains are on overload, so we have a compromised cognitive load. So when we're stressed, when we're tired, when we're frustrated or angry, our cognitive load, we are not able to make our best decisions. We're not at our best when our cognitive load is compromised. When we're under time constraints, so when we're running out of time, we need to make a quick decision. That is not the best time to make a decision because it may be guided by our implicit biases. And then an overconfidence in our objectivity. So we feel as though we're convinced that we have the ability to be objective. And so we're overly confident in that area. And so we may make a decision that we don't recognize is really guided by implicit bias because we really, truly, earnestly think that we're being objective. So then this leads us to the question of how can we be aware of our bias if we don't know we have them, or in some cases, some people may not believe that they have them. And I know we had a question earlier that was sent to me. Someone wanted to know, well, how do you communicate to someone that they have a bias if they don't believe it? So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through 11 strategies that will help us to reduce our bias. And hopefully I will answer that question specifically. And if not, then we can talk about it later. The first strategy, and let me say this, there's 11 strategies. The first 8 spell out implicit. So if that would make it an easy way for you to remember it. But the first debiasing strategy is introspection. We have to know what our biases are. We have to really pay attention to how we treat people. And we have to ask ourselves, are we treating people fairly? Are we treating them different? And if we are treating people different, why? The way that we do this, one of the more popular ways of doing this is to explore and identify our prejudices by taking what's called an implicit association test. Some of you may be familiar with it. Some of you may have already taken it. But let me talk a little bit about that. So this was developed by a group of researchers at Harvard University. And what the IAT does is it measures the relative strength of associations between pairs of concepts. So you'll see, 2 concepts, and you select the one that you most often identify with. It measures how quickly and accurately you sort through concepts. So when you're taking the test, the stronger the implicit associations, the less time it will take you to do the pairings, to match. The weaker the implicit association, the more time. So you'll be spending more time trying to decide between the pairings. And that can lead to more matching errors. This test, it really only takes about 5 to 10 minutes to complete, and I've listed the site that you can go to. And I wanted to just share, there are a ton of different tests that you can take. I've just done a screenshot here of some of the different types of tests that are offered out there. And I would encourage you can take as many as you would like. They're free. They're at no cost to you. And you can take any one. I would suggest to you all, there is a race-based test, and just given our, current conditions in society, our fight for racial justice and equity, I would encourage every one of you to take the race-based test just to see, if you do have an implicit bias based on race. There are many, many other ones, but I would absolutely encourage you to take that. Now, let me be clear. If it shows that you do have an implicit bias, I don't want to leave the impression that that means you're racist, because that's not what it means. It simply means that you have a preference for non-African Americans. It means that if you are white, then you have a preference for people who look like you. That's what it means. But it's helpful for you to know that. And so again, I would encourage you to do that. The second debiasing strategy is mindfulness. And studies have shown, empirical data, that mindfulness can lead to less emotional reactivity. It can reduce stress. It can increase our level of focus. It boosts our working memory if we just take time to basically relax, to let our minds relax and be free and really think and be more contemplative. I would also offer, prayer, whatever strategies that are helpful for you to be able to kind of relax your mind so that you're not basing your decisions, basing your actions on emotion, but that you're very thoughtful and deliberative. The next one is perspective taking. And this causes us to consider experiences from the point of view from the person or groups that are being stereotyped. And an example is, I'm sure all of you heard, I guess it's probably been a couple years now, so much has happened since the Starbucks situation, maybe within the last 1 or 2 years. But you all will recall the arrest of the 2 Black men at Starbucks for, quote, trespassing, right? So when we do perspective taking, it causes us to consider the viewpoint of the other person. So what I would encourage you to do is to think about, how would I feel if? So if I were in their position, how would that, excuse me, how would I feel? How would I have felt if I was being profiled? How would I have felt if I was arrested for just simply going to a restaurant to have a business meeting? And it causes us to really think about that. Another example, think of persons with disabilities. So how would I feel if, for instance, a person with a disability, if someone assumes that they're not capable of living a functional life? So how would I feel if someone treated me that way? Another example, I was talking to someone and they said that they were at the grocery store and then they saw this elderly lady packing her groceries into her, trunk. And they assumed that she needed help, right? So they went over to try to assist. And she said, I don't need your assistance. I'm fully capable of doing this. So it's really kind of considering the viewpoint, because what does that communicate to her? That you assume that she can't function on her own. So read, watch content that really discusses those experiences. Another suggestion I would have is, and this is something that the leaders of my organization, the Employers Association, recently did, as we were have been experiencing, the social justice movement. One of the things, and they both are white men, one of the things that they both did is they took the initiative to reach out to, people of color, specifically African Americans, to talk about and learn about their experiences. And what they told me, they talked to me as well, and what they told me is it was really an enlightening experience for them, because they did not realize the depth of systemic racism that still exists in society. The fourth one, learn to slow down. I like, this is one of my favorite phrases, pump your brakes, right? We have to learn to slow down before interacting with people from certain groups. Take a pause, reflect, to reduce our reflexive actions, reducing our susceptibility at key decision moments. Remember, we talked again about, those 4 areas, those 4 conditions that exist that cause us to not be at our best, to not make decisions that are thoughtful and deliberative. And those were ambiguous, incomplete information, when our minds are on overload, when we have time constraints and overconfidence in our objectivity. So we have to recognize when those things are present so that we are not susceptible to them when we're making key decisions. The 5th area is individuating. So we have to evaluate people based on their personal characteristics rather than those that are affiliated with their group. And one of the best examples I can use is just in terms of ageism, right? So, there are 5 generations currently in the workforce today. And we typically kind of use both the baby boomers and the millennials. And so when we look at them, and we've heard stereotypes about each of those groups, right? So we've heard stereotypes about baby boomers, that they're resistant to change, that they're set in their ways, and different things like that. Well, think about this. For those of you who hire, those of you who are responsible for filling positions, if you are filling a position and you have a baby boomer, apply for the position. Or let's say maybe you have a bias towards millennials. You have a millennial apply for that position, and you automatically label that specific individual based on the assumptions that you've made about the larger group. So it's not fair, right? So we have to evaluate people based on their personal characteristics, what it is that they specifically can bring to the table, not based on their group affiliation. And of course, avoid making snap decisions based on stereotypes. The next debiasing strategy is really check your messaging. Be very thoughtful about the messages that you send. So as opposed to saying things like, we don't see color, I don't see color. And I'm often asked, people often ask, well, what is wrong with that statement? Well, what it conveys is, if you say, I don't see color, what it conveys is, I don't see you. If you say to a person with a disability who may be in a wheelchair, for instance, if you say, I don't see your disability, what that communicates is, I don't see you. When clearly you can see that the person has a disability, clearly you can see that the person is an ethnic or racial minority. And so that's why that statement is problematic. Also, avoid microaggressive actions or words. So for a racial minority to say, you're so articulate, that's very offensive, because what it conveys is, what it communicates is, I didn't expect you to be articulate. Or you don't look Jewish. Well, what did you expect me to look like? Or what do you expect Jews to look like? And so these are the type, and I don't have time to go into, microaggressions. That's a whole nother training, and maybe Jeff and Julie will invite me back in another time to do that. But that's a whole nother separate training. But we have to be conscious and mindful of our messaging, of the words that we use. The next one is institutionalize fairness. And this speaks really from an organizational standpoint. So as leaders of organizations, as business owners, support a culture of diversity and inclusion, and really equity as well, at the organizational level. One of the best things you can do is to share your stories. So to share your stories about, various experiences that you've had with people from different cultures, or to share your experiences about times where you've experienced microaggressive behavior. And microaggressions are not just committed against, racial minorities. It's committed against women, persons with disabilities, members of the LGBTQI community. I mean, it runs the whole gamut, right? For those of you who have business resource groups, and they go by a lot of different names, affinity groups, if you have those, as leaders in your organization, make sure that you're supporting those resource groups. If you don't currently have those, I would suggest that you implement those. Make D&I updates a standing item at your regular leadership team meetings, where you're talking about it. You're talking to identify, where are we in terms of well, first of all, hopefully it's part of your strategic objectives. And if it is, then you're talking about, well, where are we in terms of meeting the strategic objective of creating a more diverse and inclusive work environment. Explore, this is one of my favorite ones, explore the individual and embedded systems of unconscious bias that are present within the organization. So for instance, look at your recruiting and hiring strategies. Is there bias built in to your systems? Looking at your hiring managers, your hiring groups, looking at your interview panels. Are they diverse? Are your interview panels diverse? Are they representative of the community that you serve, of your workforce? And really looking at that, and looking at your questions, looking at how you're advertising for your positions. Do you have any level of bias built into your job postings? So looking at every dimension of your organization. Reviewing images in your office to see, do they further or do they undercut stereotypes? Are the images that you use, for instance, on your websites, are they diverse? Do they represent multiculturalism? And then another area that we don't always think about when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, but your supplier diversity. Are your suppliers diverse? Are you offering opportunities to all of your suppliers, or a random group of diverse suppliers? Are you inviting them to the table? Are you allowing them to have some of your contracts? And I'm moving quickly here. I can't believe how this time has gone by so quickly. The next strategy is resisting implicit bias is lifelong work. It really is. It's not something that, you take the implicit bias association test and I'm done. It's lifelong work. And so you have to be deliberate, intentional about, sticking with it, restarting the process, looking for new ways to improve. Number 9, intergroup contact. So getting to know people who have different lived experiences than you, right? Connecting with them, deliberately and actively seeking out opportunities that expose you to new people, new ideas, new places. And then having authentic relationships with people who are different than you. And we're going to talk about in-group status now. This is the 10th strategy. So expanding your in-group. So the sociology dictionary defines an in-group as any group or category to which an individual belongs, right? So it may be, let's say you're into golf and you have a group of individuals who you regularly golf with. That's an in-group. Let's say the people you go to church with, that's an in-group. The people who you regularly fellowship with, that's an in-group. It can be a number of things. I wanted to point out, I like to share resources and books that I read. Miles McPherson, some of you may recognize him. He is a former NFL player. He played for the San Diego Chargers for many years, and now he lives in San Diego, and he is a pastor, so he pastors a large church out there. He wrote a book called The Third Option, Hope for a Racially Divided Nation. And in this book, he talked about in-group and out-group status, and I just wanted to quickly share that with you. So I'm not going to read through all of these because, as I said, I believe you're going to receive these slides, and so you can really read through them yourself. But when we're looking at our in-groups, those people who are like us, some of the questions, we need to ask ourselves questions. Am I more comfortable with those like me? So am I more comfortable with those who look like me? Am I more comfortable with those who have the same beliefs and values than I do? Am I more inclined to spend time socially with those who are like me? And you see all of the questions. I wish I had time to go through them in detail, but our time is waning. But really asking yourself, because when we're talking about expanding our in-group, we have to ask ourselves these honest questions. Is it easier for me to communicate with those who are like me? And if you say yes, why is that? Number 9, I possess more positive assumptions about those who are like me. And if so, why is that? The opposite is true for those who are in your out group. So I am less comfortable with those who are like me. And if we're honest about that and we say, yes, that is how I feel, ask yourself, why? Have you opened yourself up to getting to know people who are not like you? And then again, these are really the opposite of the questions that we ask ourselves as it relates to our in-group. So the next time that you encounter someone from your out-group, take a moment to assess how much out-group discrimination you're inclined to express. So if you encounter someone, am I treating them differently because I feel as though I cannot communicate with them as easily as I can with someone who's in my out group? And as it says here, practice reversing your treatment of them. Treat them. So if you encounter someone who is in an out group, try treating them like you would and receiving them like you would someone who was in your in group. And the last one here is acknowledge your privilege. What I want to say about this is I have a colleague, and she was real honest with me, and we had a conversation about it, and I was very happy that she was honest with me, because what she told me is when she hears privilege, what she hears is white privilege. And she takes offense to that because it has a certain meaning to her. And so what I explained to her is what I'm going to share with you is I explained these definitions. And so hopefully this will bring some clarity to you in regards to what privilege is. So Tiffany Jana and Michael Barron wrote a book. Actually, it came out in March of this year, and I have listed it there, Subtle Acts of Exclusion. And this book is focused on microaggressions. But in the book, they talked about privilege, and they define privilege as an advantage that is available to one group that isn't available to everyone. So we have certain advantages, we have certain privileges. And let me be clear, every one of us on this call has privilege in one way or another, whether it's based on, it can be based on any number of things. And one of the examples that I frequently use is in regards to disability discrimination. So individuals, persons with disabilities, don't always have the same privileges or advantages as persons who don't have disabilities, as able-bodied individuals. And so when we recognize those of us who are able-bodied, meaning that we don't have a physically limiting disability, we don't always recognize that we have certain privileges that are not experienced, by our friends and family members who do have a disability. Privilege is thinking that something is not a problem because it's not a problem for you personally. So what I've heard from a lot of individuals as we've been in kind of this racial justice movement is, particularly some of my white friends and counterparts, is that they didn't recognize the systemic racism because it hadn't been a problem for them. And so really through all of this, it's kind of opened their eyes to recognize that this really is a problem. But before, I didn't acknowledge it as a problem because it wasn't a problem to me personally. Privilege means one is given the benefit of the doubt. So a quick example I'll share is that I can't tell you how many times as an African American that I've been in a store, whether it's a shoe store or grocery store, that I've actually been followed around the store. And so in those instances, I wasn't given the benefit of the doubt that I was there, for legitimate business purposes, right? To purchase groceries or shoes. So I wasn't given the benefit of the doubt. And I have, friends, coworkers, colleagues who have told me they've never experienced that. And so in that instance, they were given the benefit of the doubt, right? That they had the money to buy whatever it was that they were looking for. And then lastly, privilege blinds you to the challenge that others face. So, and I've talked about that. I guess I had 12. The last one is be an active bystander. And we talk about bystander awareness in our harassment training, but as it relates to implicit bias, we also have to be active bystanders. So identify bias when we see it. When we recognize that it's happening, we have to call it out. Decide to address it. Don't ignore it. We have to be, friends to our friends. And if we see our friends being mistreated or discriminated against, we should speak up, follow up, and so on and so forth. But be an active bystander. Lastly, the last thing that I want to encourage you all to do is, and I'm going to share my screen again. Hold on, I need to stop share, and then I need to share again. Uh-oh, hold on, stop share. Okay, let's see, let's try this one more time. There we go. Okay, can you all see the Word document on my screen? Okay, perfect. So action. we've talked about a lot of things. Now it's time for action, right? So here is a worksheet that I want to leave you all with, and I really encourage and challenge you all to go through this exercise. It's called a debiasing implicit bias worksheet. And remember, we talked about the first step is acknowledging that you do have a bias. And what this worksheet does is it helps you to really identify what it is. So I have a bias against. So name what group of individuals, that you have a bias against. And what are those assumptions that you make? So I typically make these types of assumptions about this particular group of individuals. And then why is that a concern to you? Why is that particular bias a concern to you? Maybe it's a concern to you because you don't want to pass that belief down to your children. You don't want it to be kind of a generational thing where those beliefs continue to be passed down. I think that the individual to whom I have a bias against would feel. So name it. How would they feel? Again, and even think in terms of perspective taking that we talked about earlier. So put yourself in their shoes and how do you think that they would feel? Think of some positive examples of individuals in that particular group that you have a bias against that don't fit, that stereotype or those assumptions. And then lastly, identify ways that you can increase opportunities with the groups that you have a bias against. And I am completely out of time now. And so I want to thank you all. I know there were a ton of questions that were brought forth. I would be happy to take those questions and then submit responses to Jeff and Julie afterwards. I apologize. I had a lot of content to get through. So I'm going to turn it back over to Jeff. Thank you all.
Thanks, Sheila. Very informative. We did have a couple questions that came in that maybe we can just touch on briefly.
Okay, sure.
Do you have suggestions for how employers can attract a more diverse candidate pool when hiring?
Absolutely. So one of the ways is to go to where they are. And what I mean by that is if you are looking to attract, more African Americans, find out what are some of the more prevalent resources that you can use. So are there certain publications? Are there certain associations? In Toledo, we have the African American Leadership Council through the United Way. Really identifying, okay, where can I find those groups of individuals? Another example, and I'm using this as an example because I just had our inclusion conference last week and we had the Ability Center that came. They were one of our presenters and they did a panel for us and they provided us with a list. And in fact, I'll send it to you, Jeff, and you can send it out. They provided us with a list of resources that organizations can use if they are interested in recruiting persons with disabilities. So that's my response, is to find out, to go where they are, to look at, where women, are there women associations? If you're looking to diversify and hire more women, what women's groups and associations can you tap into?
Great, thank you. Those are all good suggestions. The second question is, do you have suggestions on how to know you are inclusive or how to objectively measure inclusiveness?
Absolutely. I do have, I have a survey that, and I'll make a note of it to send that to you, that really kind of measures, it's a survey that you fill out, you go through and you ask questions, and you're hopefully answering it honestly. That really determines how inclusive you are, how inclusive your organization is. So yes, so I'm writing this down. Send.
I am too, so we'll both have it covered.
Yes. And as long as you all are okay, I'm okay hanging on and answering questions.
One of the other is, I'd like to hear more about political bias. It seems to me like this is an area where the rubber meets the road. Do we try to stay away from this topic?
Wow. So this, I'm putting on my HR hat now. What we typically recommend is there are a couple areas within an organization that we suggest that you stay away from. It's politics, sex, and religion. I guess that's three. Those areas we just do not think are yield productive conversations in the work environment, and particularly in this political climate that we are in right now. And so my HR hat tells me to stay away from that conversation. But I think if an organization is interested in having that type of conversation, I would suggest that you bring in a skilled facilitator who is able to facilitate that type of conversation. I would not recommend that you as the leader or you have someone in your organization who is not skilled in facilitating, and particularly in facilitating that type of conversation. I don't think that would be a good idea. So I don't know if that answered the question, but hopefully it gave you some guidance.
I think that those are the only questions that we had in the chat box. If anyone has anything else, feel free to jump in now, or if you have questions after the fact, feel free to email them to myself or Julie Sanderson, and we can connect with Sheila and make sure that those questions get answered.